to the greenhouse. We're in full swing here. It is May 7th. Things are going according to plan, but even a little ahead of schedule. We've got Brussels sprouts going in here right now, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, tons of tomato plants, and a lot of different varieties of seedlings, basil, and some herbs and things coming up as well. So there's lots to take care of and lots to get out in the garden. Today, what I thought I would show you guys is how we start every single seed that comes into the greenhouse, how we start them, and why it's beneficial, essentially. So what we're going to talk about today is soil blocking. So this is a soil block right here, and essentially the idea is we're trying to eliminate the use of any sort of plastic or products that use petroleum products in production, so that we can be both environmentally conscious, sustainable, and responsible as we move forward in agriculture. So this is sort of something that belongs more in the camp of regenerative agriculture. There's nothing specifically regenerative about it other than that we're not using unsustainable materials. It just sort of suits the values of that model of agriculture. So as you can see, this is a small little broccoli plant that has grown up out of the soil block. It's too big for the soil block. You don't typically wait for the plant to get quite this large, but as you'll see from some B-roll that we run around here, there's a lot to stay on top of. So some of them have gotten ahead of us. So that's essentially what it looks like when the plant grows in a soil block. It's fairly stable. You can move it around, you can touch it. A lot of people are like, oh, isn't it going to just crumble? It's like, typically not, because it fills with roots and is dense enough to sort of hold its own. So that is a soil block. The next thing I'm going to show you guys is how to make them. So the first thing we're going to start with is the recipe. So the recipe for soil blocks essentially is threefold in our greenhouse. What we're using is ProMix, and the ProMix was very graciously donated to us by Charlie West from the Indoor Farmer here in town. I believe they also have a store in Kitchener, and I reached out to Charlie a while ago just about purchasing a skid of ProMix for this express purpose, and he was kind enough to donate that to our cause because he believed in it. So thank you, Charlie. That's been an immense help. So what we do is we start with this, I think that's like a 10-gallon bucket of ProMix. And the nice thing about ProMix is ProMix has, first of all, the bonding agent, which is peat. So peat is essentially, something that they get out of swamps that is, it sort of acts like as a polymer or a cellulose in the soil block and holds it together, holds the structure. The nice thing about ProMix is it also has vermiculite or perlite in it, which is like the little white things you see. And the reason why they add that is because it helps with drainage. It'll absorb excess moisture and make sure that we don't have much standing water inside the soil, because we want to keep kind of flushing our soil when we're in a greenhouse environment. So what I do is I add one of these to the wheelbarrow that I mix in, and then I add, the next thing is sea compost. So sea compost, any compost will do. If you have your own compost going right now, that's just as good, if not better. Sea compost I like because it's a little bit more sophisticated in terms of the nutrients that it delivers. It's really high density, so I don't have to use a ton of it, and it adds a little bit of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, like the three bigs for growing plants. It also has calcium and some extra things in it that's nice for letting the plant grow healthily, essentially. So this is basically like fertilizer we're adding in here. There is fertilizer in the ProMix as well, but I always like to add just a little extra. I do about a half of one of these, which is maybe a 2-gallon bucket. I'm not quite sure. Probably should have checked that out before. The next thing I add is sand. So this is a new thing I've started doing. You can use green sand, which has, again, some more nutrient value. It's kind of hard to find. So what I'm just using is sand. Sand does have nutrients and minerals in it that might not be in the sea compost or inside of the ProMix. But the other nice thing about it, too, is The peat can really get quite strong in a soil block, and they kind of stop the roots from being able to push through easily. And what we're trying to do when a seed's really new is we're trying to provide an environment, a nurturing environment for it, that it's going to have a really easy time pushing through that soil. We don't want to sort of push its limits or try to strengthen it through giving it obstacles when it's in its early developmental stages. We want to do the opposite. We want to allow it to develop. We want to nurture it just like a child, and we want to encourage it and encourage its growth. So I add a little bit of about half of one of these little guys of sand in there. You can kind of toy around with the sand. You just want to make sure you don't add too much, because if you do add too much, your soil blocks won't adhere. I had it all dry, and then what I like to do is give it a mix. So while it's nice and dry and everything's sort of like just easy to mix, essentially, it's wet, it's going to get bound up, and I'm not going to be able to see inside the sand throughout, the compost throughout. I'm not going to be able to see those different elements because it's just all going to essentially be the same color. So I give it a nice big mix, and then once I've done that, I fill up another one of these buckets and I add it into the wheelbarrow, my mixing thing. So we'll take a quick break here, and I'll do that, and we'll move on to the next stage. Sound good? So the next stage is once we have the dry mix thoroughly set, and we can kind of see, you know, sand in there. We can see the peat in there, the vermiculite, and the compost. We can see all of those things in there. We know that we sort of have like a good mix going on here. It's pretty evenly dispersed. Sand clumps a little bit because it's a little bit wet right now. But then the next thing I'm going to do is, once I'm confident that I've thoroughly and evenly mixed my soil block mix, I grab the hose and I give it a really good spray down. You'd be surprised at how much water this takes. This is going to take a while, so we'll probably cut to something else while this is going on, because this could take a minute. Now the amount of water you add, you're going to have to just play with it. I haven't measured out the exact like liters I put in here. I've been doing this for a little while, so you kind of get a sixth sense about these things as you do them more. Like it becomes more intuitive. But essentially, what you're looking for is something that it will emit water when you squeeze it, which you'll see in a second. Is basically the idea is you want it to be wet, but you don't want it to be drenched. Because if it's too wet, again, you're going to have a hard time keeping the soil block as a cohesive unit when it comes time to press them out. So I'm going to go ahead and keep adding the water here. Okay. And then once I'm kind of confident I've got a decent amount of water in there, I give it a good mix. Make sure all the dry ingredients are getting moisture in there, because the peat kind of almost repels the water in a way. Hence why it lives in a bog, essentially. It's sort of almost hydrophobic in a way. So you got to really drench it and mix it to get it to take that moisture on. But once it does, it holds it really nicely. Okay. All right. So once we've got it all mixed up like that, what I like to do is take a handful of it, and I kind of give it a squeeze, and you can kind of see the water kind of coming out. That's kind of when I know it's in a good state. Also, if you can form like a good snowball with it, that's a pretty good example that it's going to stay together. It's going to be solid. So it's another quick little test. Let me just rinse off my hands here. Cool. So now we're going to move on to pressing out our soil blocks. So now we're just like in a different part of the greenhouse here. And this is basically like the nursery element here. We have 2 tables laid out, and this is sort of designated exclusively for nursery work. Why this area of the greenhouse? The reason is because there is less sunlight, and sunlight isn't necessary for germination. All you need for germination is heat, which we get from our new unit heater and moisture, essentially. So we reserve sort of the more sunny parts of the greenhouse for plants that are in the vegetative state and need a lot of solar energy, essentially, UV, to create photosynthesis, essentially. So this is a soil blocker. They're fairly popular right now, so they might be hard to come by. They're not super cheap. I think they're about $45 or $50 or something like that. But if you think about the cost and expense of buying a bunch of like seeding trays or whatever, what have you, they certainly pay for themselves, and it's also like more sustainable. Metal can be recycled actually without too much of a process, so that's also nice environmentally speaking. So what I like to do is take a platform, because you need somewhere that you can lay out your soil blocks. So here's, I'm just using plywood. Sometimes I use some scraps from the walls when they were renovated. It doesn't really matter what you use. Obviously, like, you don't want rotting wood or anything like that, but just basically a surface that you can lay out your soil blocks on. The next thing I do is I take like a 1x1, 2x2, whatever it is, and I lay it out on the plywood in sort of an L shape. And what that does is it allows me to have a border to lay them in. You're also going to want to keep it on there because the soil blocks on the outside tend to dry out, just because I don't know if that's a watering thing or just exposure to air. It might be a little bit of column A, a little column B. But I find that if you have a border around them, that typically doesn't happen, and you don't suffer any sort of crop drag around the edges when you do that. So the next thing is making the soil block. So water is really, really important. It keeps the device clean and sort of lubricated so that the soil blocks will come off cleanly. So I always have a clean bucket of water. I dunk my soil block in there, soil blocker, and then I fill it with the mix. You can do it this way, or you can just press it straight down in. Doesn't really matter. And then what I do is I come over to the table here, and I press it out. Boom. And we have a row of soil blocks. Come back over, rinse it off again. Fill the soil blocker. Sort of make sure it's flush on the bottom, because if there's a big hump on the bottom, they won't really sit flatly or uniformly across the surface you're planting them on. And that's your soil blocks. What I would do normally, it would probably take me a little bit of time, so we won't do it now, is I would fill this whole this whole surface with all of my soil blocks, and then they have like little dimples inside them that are created through these little doodads here, and that's basically allowing you a place to put your seeds in the center of the block. There's 2 things you can do with that. You can, when you drop the seed into the impression, you can cover it or not. I've had success doing both. If you want to cover them, what I recommend doing is taking a little bit of dried Pro Mix or whatever sort of mix you're using, seeding mix or whatever it is, and just sprinkle it very lightly over the seed just to cover it enough. You don't have to fill the block right in or pack it in. It's going to have enough moisture and stability in there with just that to grow. I also tried an entire tray just not covering it all with various plants. There was tomatoes, peppers, cabbage, broccoli, some hibiscus tea, some onions, and I had great success with that. Like, I think about 90% germination now I'm looking over at it. So cover or not, up to you. Experiment, play with it. It's really, up to the soil blocker's choice, discretion, essentially. Yeah, so like once that happens, the next thing you need to know is how to water it. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to drench a soil block. So I'm just going to grab the hose and I'll show you guys basically how I water the soil blocks, and hopefully you can do the same at home. So what I like to do is I just want to mist them. So when you have a greenhouse this size, this process takes a long time. But I mean, if you think about it, each flat of, at this size anyways, of soil block, you've got about between 100 and 150 plants within each flat, essentially. So that's probably more than most even home gardeners would need. So it's going to be fairly easy to water, not as time consuming as doing an entire greenhouse. But what you want to do is you just want to mist the top of it, and you always want to keep your soil blocks moist. You don't want to let them dry out, because what happens is if the soil block dries out, it's really hard to introduce water back into the center of the block, which is really where the root is developing at its highest rate, essentially. So you just want to, make sure every day, give them a little bit of a spray. If you notice a little bit of a green, like mildewy moss sort of filling up, like coming on top, which can happen because they do have to stay continually moist, is you might want to just back off on the watering a little bit. Still water every day, maybe not as intensely. And another key is keeping airflow over top of it. So I have fans that I run over top of these to sort of keep that and minimize that. And then also, of course, keeping them in the sun. UV is great for stifling that sort of growth, any sort of like mildew or anything like that. So that's essentially how you water. You're just going to want to give them a nice little surface coating till you sort of start to see the water build up and they sort of look like a deep chocolatey brownie color. A lot of people say that soil blocks look like brownies. That's a common thing I hear. And that's essentially it. A few reasons why you might want to consider soil blocking as well, things I've read, is that soil blocks, for one thing, the germination rate I've had using them versus inside of seeding trays is excellent. This year in the greenhouse, we've had over 90% germination rate. I did not see that in last year when we were using the plastic trays. Another thing too is the plant's development, I feel like, is accelerated through using soil blocks, because what happens is as the plant develops, let's grab this little hibiscus guy here. As this plant develops, essentially what's going to happen is the roots are going to grow throughout the soil block, but they know enough not to develop outside of the soil block because of the air gap that's around them. So each soil block has a little air gap around the outside that stops the root from developing. So it sort of stalls the plant or presses pause until it's ready to graduate into a larger soil block, which these smaller ones will fit. Either you can plant them right into the ground, or you can get a bigger soil blocker where this little cube will fit right inside a larger soil block, and you can continue the plant's development that way. I've read that what the benefit to that is that when a plant is in a plastic medium, the roots tend to spin and continue to search for nutrients, and it creates a really clustered effect. That has two negative effects. One is that when you put your plant outside, it won't take to the soil quite as fast as something developed in a soil block. In a soil block, the roots are ready to just shoot out into the soil as soon as they're given the opportunity, as soon as you close the gap. The other plant with the spiralized roots is going to continue to search around in there, and it can take up to a week before them to actually start reaching into the soil you've planted them in. And one of the reasons why that can be bad is it can actually create a plant that is less genetically strong and more of a target for pests. Pests always look for plants that don't belong, so non-native plants, and plants that are weaker, because they're basically trying to weed out survival of the fittest, the weakest elements in the crop. So just some things to think about, some things I've been reading about, and I find it really beneficial, and I found that it has accelerated the process of germination and growth quite a bit. And I've seen nothing but positive benefits here environmentally and in terms of growing healthy food. So that's what I have for you today. I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions, I guess you can ask underneath the Facebook post or on the website, wherever this will be posted. And I'll get back to you and try to answer your questions.